Thank you. The Chairperson, African Ombudsman Research Centre, President of the African Ombudsman and Mediators Association, and Public Protector of South Africa, Advocate Busisiwe Mkhwebane, Honorable Madeleine Nchr, Ombudsman of New Zealand, our distinguished speakers, Mr. Ben Buckland, Senior Advisor, Association of Prevention of Torture, Mr. Peter Boshier, Chief Ombudsman of New Zealand, Mr. Tom Lord, Optional Protocol to the Convention Against Torture Inspector, New Zealand, and Ms. Temekile Nhlanzingema, Director of Legal Services, Judicial Inspectorate for Correctional Services, South Africa. Excellencies, Honorable Ombudsmen who are joining us, distinguished participants and guests, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Vice-Chancellor and the Council of the University of KwaZulu-Natal, as well as the Dean of the School of Law, I have great pleasure in welcoming you to this morning's webinar session on visiting places of detention. Our host today is the African Ombudsman Research Centre, known as AORC, which is the research and training arm of the African Ombudsman and Mediators Association, known as AOMA. When the COVID-19 pandemic broke out, AORC was swift to revise its training program in line with the various lockdown restrictions. I am heartened to report that despite the challenges following the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, we are continuing to deliver on our mandate to promote capacity development and generate knowledge and professionalism within AOMA in furtherance of good governance, the rule of law, and the protection of human rights. An ombudsman is an official who is charged with representing the public's interests by investigating and addressing complaints of maladministration or a violation of of rights by public authorities. In general terms, an ombudsman is a state official appointed to provide a check on government activities in the interests of the citizen and to oversee the investigation of complaints of improper government activity against the citizen. Public officers make decisions and determinations in the course of delivering services relating to, among others, defending the country, taxation, regulating the economy, and the protection of the rights of individuals. They are expected to make those decisions and determinations in a fair and non-oppressive manner to the benefit of the members of the public. The citizens will turn to the ombudsman when the public officer's decision or determination is or is seen to be unfair or oppressive. By checking allegations of maladministration and inquiring into the decision-making process, the ombudsman can determine how a decision was made and consequently make recommendations that target an improved service and, more importantly, help to prevent similar occurrences in the future. If the goal of the ombudsman is to ensure good governance prevails and that acts of maladministration are rectified, then it goes to the heart of upholding the functions of a democratic state. This morning's webinar will be talking to an issue that is hugely important to the citizenry and to ensuring accountability in a manner in which the public performs its functions when persons are placed at the mercy of the state. Places of detention are facilities or places in which detainees or inmates cannot freely leave. They include prisons, mental health facilities, intellectual disability facilities, aged care facilities, COVID-19 managed isolation and quarantine facilities, and immigration detention centers, among others. After visiting the place of detention, the Ombudsman may make recommendations where necessary to improve the conditions of detention and detainee treatment. I would like to thank you for your participation in these proceedings once again, and to once again welcome you to this interesting discussion that is to follow. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good morning, PP. Kindly take over.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning to all the panelists and the participants. Thank you so much for availing yourselves for this very important webinar. And the speaker who just spoke now, Ms. Lindiwe Makutu, has already summarized what the Ombudsman is all about. As the Public Protector South Africa, I am the chairperson of the African Ombudsman Research Centre board. And since it's hosted in South Africa, normally we support them on behalf of the board and on behalf of the African Ombudsman and Mediators Association. Since I'm the president of the African Ombudsman and Mediators Association, we support all these engagements and we support all these interactions. But then I would also want to add to what Ms. Makutu has said, that as ombudsmen or public protectors, we are there for the protection and of the citizens and even the public at large. Being South Africa, which has acceded to various international treaties and international conventions, which OPCAT is one of them. And we have the South African Human Rights Commission, which is the Chapter 9 institution, also monitoring whether there is no violation of the rights of the prisoners. So as the Public Protector South Africa, we also have the Forum for Institutions Supporting Democracy, where we have the Public Protector South Africa, the South African Human Rights Commission, the Auditor General, the South African Commission on Gender Equality, and the Commission for Religious and Linguistic Rights, but then also other constitutional institutions like your Public Service Commission. Therefore, I must indicate that such engagements will also be very much helpful. I can see in South Africa, we have invited a colleague from the prisons inspectorate, or the inspector which inspects various prisons and on how prisoners are being assisted. But then being the public protector, we do receive complaints directly from prisoners as well, especially on matters relating to any maladministration, undue delay, and all those. So thank you so much for your participation, and we hope that you will be of assistance in imparting knowledge to us and the participants, and we will then appreciate your information, and we hope you will share your presentations with Frankie the organizers of this event, so that we can continuously learn from your experiences in various countries. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, PP. Honorable Madeleine, please take over to facilitate this program.
Thank you so much. I'm Nchr Madeleine. I'm the Chief Ombudsman of the Rwanda Ombudsman Office. Previous to this position, I have been chairperson of the National Commission for Human Rights for 8 years. and I'm very pleased and honored to facilitate this session. And I'd like to welcome the audience and this juncture to thank the organizing, the African Ombudsman Research Centre and the African Ombudsman and the Mediators Association for organizing this important session. I'd like to introduce also panelists. They are three. The first panelist is Mr. Ben Buckland, Senior Advisor and within Association of Prevention of Torture. You are most welcome, Ben, and it's a pleasure to see you again. I have worked with him many years ago in the National Commission for Human Rights. The second speaker is Mr. Peter Boshier, Chief Ombudsman of New Zealand. And there will be also Mr. Tom Lord, OPCAT Inspector, New Zealand. Mr. Peter Boshier is the Chief Ombudsman of New Zealand, and she was also a regional president for Australian Pacific Ombudsman region. And now he'll be speaking in this session. The third speaker is Mrs. Timbeliwe Ngema, Director of Legal Services and Judicial Inspectorate for Correctional Services in South Africa. As already mentioned by Dr. Lindiwe and Honorable Busisiwe, Public Protector of South Africa and President of AOMA, and Chairperson of African Ombudsman Research Centre, the Ombuds Office and the staff have a critical role in visiting places of detention and doing advocacy for improving the condition of inmates, detainees and inmates, meaning that detention places include not only prisons, but also mental health facilities, intellectual disabilities facilities, immigration facilities at the various airports, and so on. Without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to the first panelist, first speaker, Mr. Ben. We have the floor. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I'll just see if I can share my screen. Hopefully this is going to work. Does that work? Hopefully you can see that. That seems to work. So first of all, thank you so much to the organizers of this event, the University of KwaZulu-Natal, AOMA, and also to the fellow panelists, many of whom I've known for quite some time, but it's always a pleasure to see so many of you again. Colleagues from New Zealand, from Rwanda, from South Africa, colleagues from Georgia among the participants, people from all over the world. And I think if we think about silver linings of this pandemic, then one of them really has been the opportunity, even if it's only virtually, to be able to come together far more often than we have in the past. So today I want to talk about three things. The first is about the torture prevention and the torture prevention system a little bit in general. The second is about ombuds institutions as national preventive mechanisms as part of that torture prevention system, but then both as multiple body NPMs. And sorry for those who it already goes into technical OPCAT talk. I'll try and keep things at a level that everything that makes sense for everybody. And also when an ombudsman is just the NPM. And then I'll talk about, as a last point, what happens when ombuds institutions are not a national preventive mechanism, where there's another body in the country that's doing torture prevention work, how ombuds institutions can be engaged and effective on torture prevention alongside another or several other bodies who are working on this topic. So first of all, OPCAT and torture prevention. And firstly, torture prevention, I think, is different because it's a couple of things. First of all, it's forward-looking in that it's not much concerned with past violations, rather with preventing future acts. It's holistic in that the aim is to look at the whole system from the very micro level of how a specific place is being managed and what is happening in a specific place where people are being detained, all the way up through the levels of policy and levels of procedure, up to the laws and the national culture and everything that might contribute to violations of human rights at all of those different levels. It's also focused on risks. So people who are in situations of vulnerability by virtue of who they are, moments of risk. For example, at the APT, we spent a lot of time in the last few years focusing on the first hours of police custody as a particular moment of risk, because we know that during interrogations and during arrest and transfer to police stations, people are at particular risk of torture and treatment. And torture prevention is also focused on particular places where people might be at particular risk, places that are closed off to outside monitoring or that are outside the normal purview of a detention system. And then also at practices, at the use of restraints. And I know the New Zealand Ombudsman's worked extensively on that issue, and I'll maybe can share some of that with us a little bit later. So this focus on risk is absolutely central to torture prevention, the torture prevention system. It's also centered very much on dialogue, where reports and recommendations that are made by torture prevention bodies, including ombuds institutions, are the basis for constructive engagement with the authorities. And I feel like dialogue is one of those words that at least that I say, and I assume that everyone is on the same page about what it means, but I think it's worth giving a quick example of what that can look like in practice. And an example comes from Switzerland, where I'm based, where the national preventive mechanism here, on the basis of visits to 7 juvenile detention places, wrote what it thought were the main findings of that of those visits, then organized a closed-door meeting with the authorities to say, look, this is what we found, this is what we think the recommendations are going to be, and let's have a discussion about, are those recommendations feasible? Are we missing things? What from your point of view would really help us to get to the place that we all want to get to, which is where people detained in those places are being treated with dignity. And what that meant was not that the NPM was not independent because it was talking to the authorities. What it meant was that once the recommendations were published, the authorities were already on board with them and ready to put them into practice. And to me, that's what kind of OPCAT type dialogue is all about. Torture prevention, of course, is linked to the OPCAT, the optional protocols of Convention Against Torture, which time flies. I feel like I'm getting older, but I think it's now 15 years old, maybe, almost 15 years. And the treaty establishes 2 things. One, an international body. It's called the Subcommittee for the Prevention of Torture, which is 25 members taken from OPCAT states all around the world, and they do a few things, but one of the things that they do is also conduct visits in OPCAT member states. But the heart of the OPCAT is really this system of national preventive mechanisms. So national bodies that are independent and that have the power to visit all places where people are detained or may be detained. And this is important because it's really, really broad. I'm speaking tomorrow with the NPM of the United Kingdom, who are at the moment looking at beginning visits to private homes where some people with psychosocial disabilities are potentially going to be detained as part of some legislative changes there. So it's really, really broad and much broader than just what we call traditional places of detention, like prisons and police stations and so forth. Their power also includes to interview anyone that they meet there, to talk to anyone in private, to review any sorts of documents that they see, and to make recommendations. And around the world, there are 60-something national preventive mechanisms. I should know that number. And many, if not most of them actually, are ombuds institutions. Most of the MPMs in Europe and Latin America are ombuds institutions. And one of the reasons for this is that in those places, the National Human Rights Institution and the National Human Rights Commission and the Ombudsman are one institution. So if you're a state that's ratified the OPCAT and you're looking for a body to fulfill that role, then it's pretty obvious which one it should be. If you're not going to establish something new, which obviously lots of countries have also done. In Africa, however, things are a little bit different. MPMs on the continent are mostly national human rights institutions. So that's the case, as Madeline mentioned, in Rwanda, in Togo, in Morocco, in Mali, in Madagascar, in Mauritius, and very likely soon in Benin, Burkina Faso as well. In Senegal and Tunisia and Mauritania, they have new institutions that are created just to fulfill this role. And then, of course, as you know, in South Africa, there's a multiple body institution coordinated by the Human Rights Commission, but including different ombudsman institutions as well as part of that system. So onto my second point, which is about ombuds institutions as MPMs. And here I'm going to talk in general terms, and I always feel bad being the first speaker because I don't want to tread on what the people who come after are going to say, and so I might speak quite generally here, and then I know that that Peter Boshier and Tom Lord, and I saw that Ruth from New Zealand is here as well, and going to be able to add some real detail on how that work happens in practice. But I think in really general terms, there are some obvious challenges and both opportunities, not for all institutions, but for many institutions when they become MPMs or when they take on a torture prevention function. And one of the first of these is that ombuds institutions, at least traditionally, often have a very legalistic approach, staffed largely with lawyers, and this contrasts with the kind of multidisciplinary and holistic approach that that's required to do torture prevention. Very often when we talk to people about torture prevention, new MPMs, for example, then their questions are, well, so what is the definition? What's the Article 5 definition of torture? And sure, we can talk about that, but I think from a torture prevention point of view, that's almost not the point. The point is about human dignity, and it often means that. So it's less about adherence to sometimes to standards and norms, and more about thinking about what dignity means in practice. And I can talk about some examples of that if people are interested in the question and answers. So in the majority of cases, the solution to this has been for ombuds institutions to become MPMs to create an MPM department, has the ability to have some degree of autonomy and to do things with a slightly different style of methodology and practices from the way they would have done things previously. And of course, this doesn't mean that there aren't significant synergies. And I think that the most effective ombuds institutions that have taken on a torture prevention mandate are the ones where they've established internal procedures for planning and identifying joint strategies, and for communicating and for sharing information. And I think this is particularly the case when it comes to complaints, which are obviously a traditional role of ombuds institutions. And in most institutions, the practice has been that a complaints department continues to deal with individual complaints, including those relating to detention, while a prevention department focuses on more systemic issues. And so, for example, an individual complaint might be received and then followed up on by the National Preventive Mechanism Department, but also that there's information sharing from the complaints handling department about what complaints are being received and what that should mean in terms of priorities and what to focus on. I think I might skip over talking about ombuds institutions that are part of multiple body institutions, particularly because that's the case in New Zealand, and I think the other panelists are going to have much more interesting things to say about that. But I think a key point is just in those institutions that work well, and I think this one's a great example of this, is to just establish clearly what the jurisdiction of each institution is. Think about working together in ways that can help each institution to achieve change in bigger cross-cutting areas, and then to set up systems of regular exchange at formal and high level, high levels, but also at informal and lower levels of all the institutions involved. So my third and final point is about ombuds institutions that aren't national preventive mechanisms, but how they can work with NPM. So this is the case.
Ben, you have 4 minutes.
4 minutes, that's perfect.
You have 4 minutes, yes.
Almost done. So this is a case in Rwanda, for example, Madeline just speaking there, where there's an ombuds institution that's alongside a national preventive mechanism. And I think this is the case in most African countries now that have ratified OPCAT. So, and I think it's a key point, because just because there's an NPM doesn't mean that an ombuds institution can't do torture prevention or can't have a really important role. And I think first of these is in relation to domestic initiatives. And I think there's clearly moments where mandates overlap and priorities align. And I think these kind of institutions are going to be most effective when they at least sit down at some point in the planning cycle and talk about where those overlaps might be. And again, to have points of contact at different levels of the organization that are both formal and informal is really important. And also a way to respond to urgent situations in a way that's coherent. And I think there's an example. I won't mention the country, but there's an example I know from a few years ago, where a country with both a Human Rights Commission, there was an NPM, and an ombuds institution were responding to some cases of police violence, and they both released reports on the event that had conflicting recommendations in them. And for the government, this was perfect, because they could just first talk about how ineffective these independent institutions were, but then also just pick and choose the recommendations that they wanted, and set the bar as low as possible. And I think this is an example of how it absolutely shouldn't work. Examples of how things can work. It's not an example relating to ombuds institutions specifically, but I've had a project for the last few years in Madagascar that we've on safeguards in police custody, and we're just evaluating that project at the moment. And one of the really surprising things that came out of the evaluation was realizing that implementing better custody registers in police stations actually had not only a human rights impact in that people had better access to families, which was one of our objectives, but also had an anti-corruption impact in that, because they had to write down, yes, the person was able to call their family when a detainee was brought into the police station, it made it harder for them to charge detainees money for that. So there was an anti-corruption impact. And of course, anti-corruption as part of maladministration generally is a priority of many ombuds institutions. I think that's an example of the kind of thing where there's a significant overlap between a torture prevention focused body and a maladministration focused body. And then very final point, and I hope I haven't run over time, is links to the international system. So as you know, the burden of reporting on treaties for countries like South Africa that have ratified a huge number of human rights treaties is pretty significant. Also, the expense of going to the meetings in Geneva and New York and coordinating civil society to write shadow reports and so forth is a huge amount of work. And I think it makes enormous sense for ombuds institutions and national human rights institutions and torture prevention bodies and whatever they are to work together in some way to both access that system, because it can have enormous impacts in terms of because it can help them implement their recommendations domestically, but also because it can help them save in resources. So that's it. Thanks a lot. I'm obviously around for the entire rest of the panel for questions, or you're also welcome to email me or follow up if there's anything I said that's interesting or that you want to talk more about. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ben. I'd like to call the audience to unmute the microphone to allow speakers to have the floor easily. Mr. Ben talked about torture prevention and highlight that it must be dialogue, it must be reports and recommendation for improving the condition of inmates or people who are in prisons or healthcare facilities or center for person. They must be also a constructive engagement with Ombudsman Office. We talked about national preventive mechanism, and as provided for by the ORC, and some example of NPMs, and they also highlight that Ombudsman Office cannot work in isolation. They have to work in synergy with NPMs and also working together on priorities. However, further ado, I'd like to
the host.
Please unmute yourself. Honorable Madeleine, unmute yourself.
Sorry, the second speaker is Mr. Peter Boshier, the Chief Ombudsman of New Zealand. You have the floor, sir. Thank you.
A very good morning to you all, and I'd like to just start by greeting you in the Indigenous native language of New Zealand. Tēnā koutou katoa, nā mihi nui mai I te Aotearoa, New Zealand. And the translation is a very warm welcome from New Zealand. To the Honourable Madeleine Nuriri, thank you for introducing me, and it's a pleasure to be able to present at this. I have the privilege of also speaking on behalf of the International Ombudsman Institute, of which I'm a board member, and I want to acknowledge one of the Secretariat who is one of the 117 participants today, and that is Ulrika Gracehofer from Austria. So thank you all for joining in. My object is to make this interesting and informative. We're going to split up the tasks. I'm going to tell you a little bit about where the Ombudsman fits into the national preventative mechanism in New Zealand. And then one of my inspectors will give you the detail of how we actually do this work. I'm then going to come back to you and just talk about the importance of recommendations and how we can achieve change. I just want to start off by making this point to many of the ombudsmen who are present and participating. We've had the role of a national preventative mechanism in New Zealand for 14 years. I find that the respect that the Office of Ombudsman has in my country means that when I do this OPCAT work, I'm taken really seriously by the government and by the people of New Zealand. So certainly I find that this work is some of the most rewarding and the best work that I'm able to do. Just want to talk a little bit about the background. So we were given the designation 14 years ago by Parliament, and as we all know, we call it OPCAT for short. This is really, really interesting work. I have to say, of all the ombudsman work that I do, this OPCAT work is some of the most rewarding and some of the highest profile. I've got a mandate to inspect prisons, mental health facilities, intellectual disability facilities. Then lately, because of COVID-19, we are also now looking at managed isolation and quarantine facilities. Then we're also looking at privately run aged care facilities. And that's because New Zealand has in excess of 6,000 older people in detention in dementia units. They aren't free to leave because of their illness. And so in OPCAT parlance, they are in detention, and we monitor and inspect aged care facilities. We also, though, have started immigration detention centre work and court cells. So, of course, the most recent we've had to get into are managed quarantine and isolation facilities, and I guess you're all in the same boat. People coming back to your country from abroad who then have to go into a place where they're not free to leave for anything up to 14 days. I've got my colleague Tom Lord now, who's going to talk to you about my team of inspectors, how they go about organising their work, how they write their reports, and what we say. When Tom's done his bit, it'll come back to me just to talk about the potency of recommendations. Tom, I'll now turn over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Tēnā koutou katoa. My name's Tom, and I'm really pleased to be speaking to you all today. Examining conditions of detention can be a really daunting challenge. You may be faced with an unfamiliar and challenging environment, yet you need to be able to quickly understand how detainees are treated and the conditions that they live in. One of the ways in which we overcome this challenge is by using a set criteria to guide our inspections. Today, what I'm going to do is briefly outline the 6 criteria that we use at the New Zealand Office of the Ombudsman to assist us in carrying out our inspections to places of detention. Then I'll discuss some of the information gathering tools that we use to help us make an assessment of each of the criteria. Then I'll hand back over to Peter, who will explain how he makes recommendations for improvement and how he goes about creating change. So we currently have 6 core criteria that we use to inform our prison inspections. These we developed from the guidelines for detention monitoring published by the Association for the Prevention of Torture. So it's great to have Ben with us today. And we amended these for the New Zealand context. You can find more about the APT guidelines on their website. And this is a really fantastic resource that goes into a lot more depth than I have time to go into today. So having a set criteria is really important as it helps us to structure our inspections and helps both the inspectors and the facility know what we're looking at and why. So today I'll be talking specifically about our criteria for prison inspections. Now, while there are obvious differences between prisons all around the world, these criteria are still really helpful as they cover all aspects of detention. So these 6 criteria are treatment, reception into prison, decency, dignity and respect, health and well-being, protective measures, and purposeful activity and rehabilitation. From here, I'll go through each of these criteria and speak about them in a bit more detail. So the first criteria, treatment. There are certain measures that are routinely used in prisons, such as the use of force and restraint, or the use of separation or isolation, and that can amount to torture or ill treatment if improperly used. So it's really important to look at really closely at how these measures are used and ask questions such as, if use of force and restraint is used, is it only used when necessary? Is it being carried out in accordance with approved techniques? And is it safe? Is it being recorded properly? If detainees are subjected to a period of segregation, is it for the least amount of time possible? And how are they managed? Also covered in this criteria is how potentially vulnerable detainees, such as LGBT detainees, youth, elderly, detainees with disabilities, how are these people being managed? We would also ask, how safe is the prison? Detainees free from fear of inter-prisoner violence and gang tensions? The second criteria that we look at is reception into prison. Just imagine that you've arrived into a detention facility for the first time. Detainees have told us that this can be incredibly difficult and overwhelming. Detainees should have ready access to information about where they are, how the prison operates, any rules that they need to know, and where they can get help if they need it. It's also important to look at how this information is communicated to detainees. Is it appropriate and can they understand it? We also look at if detainees receive an initial health assessment to determine their health needs. For many detainees, this may be their first time in prison, and so it's really important that these processes are robust. The third criteria that we look at is decency, dignity, and respect. So it's a fundamental right for detainees to be treated with dignity and respect. And this criteria covers several important areas, such as the material conditions of the facility and accommodation standards. Are the cells clean? Are they well maintained? Is there adequate heat, light, and ventilation? Do detainees have good access to sanitary and bathing facilities? And can they uphold their personal hygiene? Is there adequate privacy of sanitation and bathing facilities? Do detainees have adequate access to bedding and clothing? We would also look at food, the quantity and quality of it. Is it nutritious? When and how is it provided? All included in this criteria is the relationship between staff and detainees. How do staff speak to detainees? How do staff speak about detainees when they can't hear? Are requests by detainees responded to reasonably? Finally, we might look at the capacity of the prison and overcrowding. Overcrowding can be a significant issue as it can hugely exacerbate other issues such as violence, health issues, and treatment problems. We would ask what the maximum number of detainees a facility should hold is, and we check if that facility ever goes over that number. So the fourth criteria that we look at is health and well-being. Now, this is essential as periods of detention can have a hugely negative impact on people's health and well-being. Healthcare that's provided by the prison should be the same as that provided outside of the prison. Under this criteria, we might look at things such as the healthcare services and systems, including dentist and mental health support, medication provision and medication distribution. How well can detainees access healthcare? Is patients' confidentiality maintained? Can detainees consent to and refuse medical treatment? So the fifth criteria is protective measures. Protective measures are things undertaken by the prison that protect the rights and dignity of detainees. These include things such as the prison complaint system. Can a detainee make a complaint about their treatment? Is there a system for this and how well is it working? How well do detainees understand the system? Also covered by this criteria is access to mail. Can detainees send and receive mail? Are there enough telephones and can detainees access them? Do detainees have access to legal services, including legal phone calls and visits? Also in this criteria is the separation of categories of detainees, such as by age, sex, and legal status. Young detainees shouldn't be kept with older detainees, and detainees who are waiting to stand trial should not be kept with convicted or sentenced detainees. The final criteria that we look at is purposeful activity and transition to the community. This is important as detainees should be able to work on self-improvement and use their time in prison constructively. So we ask questions such as, how are detainees spending their time in prison? And how long are they spending out of their cells each day? Do detainees have access to fresh air and outdoor exercise? Is there a library service? Can families visit detainees in a safe and easy way? What education, employment, and treatment programs or opportunities are provided? So in summary, these six criteria are what we look at. And now I'd like to briefly examine how we examine these criteria. So we have a number of information gathering methods and tools that we use. The first is obviously the physical inspection of the facility itself. So during the inspection, we can observe the general conditions of the facility, such as its cleanliness and material conditions, as well as the day-to-day life, systems, and interactions between the detainees and staff. We also obtain and review facility documentation, such as policies, guidelines, and standard operating procedures. So we check that these are aligned with international human rights standards and with national legislation. We also check to see if staff are actually following these operational procedures. Third, we might review the administrative records of detainees to check that they're legally detained and have access to healthcare and programs. Fourth, we might review written records of specific events or incidents, such as use of force and restraint. We may also review camera footage of these events. Fifth, we conduct interviews and focus groups with detainees, family, and facility staff. So this gives us a really good insight into the day-to-day runnings of a facility and how detainees and their family feel about the conditions and their treatment. Finally, during a full prison inspection, we distribute a survey for the detainees to complete. Now, this survey asks questions about all aspects of prison life, from the material conditions to how safe they feel to what sort of support they're getting. So, in summary, we have our 6 criteria that we look at during prison inspections: treatment, reception into prison, decency, dignity and respect, health and well-being, protective measures, and purposeful activity in transition to the community. This is what we look at. We also have several information gathering tools that we use to help us make an assessment on each of these criteria, from the physical inspection to reviewing facility policies and documents, reviews of individual events and incidents, reviews of detainees' administrative records, interviews, and our survey. So this is how we inspect. Now I'd like to hand back over to the Chief Ombudsman, Peter Boshier, to outline how he makes recommendations for improvement and how he helps to create change. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tom, for a truly excellent overview of how you do your job. I have about 5 minutes, and I'd like to use that time to say what happens after my inspectors have gone out to their prisons. Of course, a number of these visits are unannounced. The rest of my office does not know that my team is going to a prison. We suddenly arrive and we are authorised to enter because that's what our legislation says. When my team come back, they assemble for me a provisional report. They give it to me to read through. I may have some questions I want to ask about that. Tom's outlined to you the areas that they always report to me on. Some of the prisons do well. Some routinely do not do well. I get a report on whether or not there's been an inspection already in the past and whether the prison has improved or changed. On the other hand, if there has been good progress, then I get a shorter report telling me that. What are some of the things that have most concerned me as the Chief Ombudsman about what's happened in New Zealand prisons? I want to mention quickly 4. One prisoner with mental health challenges who was self-harming badly was being tied down to a bed 16 hours a day for 37 consecutive days. I was shown the video footage of that. In my report, I said that that was cruel and inhumane. Of course, to get to torture, which I don't think I ever have, that must be intentional. Torture is rarely a criterion that we find. That's really got to be a mischievous, awful use of force. But mostly what I find is inhumane or cruel. A second thing that I found was that pepper spray was being used in an Auckland prison by guards in a way which was offensive, cruel, and degrading. It was excessive and wasn't necessary to be used in the circumstances. A third thing that we made a lot of play about was prisoners' safety. And as Tom has said, our job really is preventative. It's trying to say to prisons, this is what you should do to prevent for the future inhumane or bad conditions for prisoners. Now, in the past, some using ligature points in prison cells committed suicide. They hanged themselves. Or they had access to things in which they could self-harm in a very grievous way. As a result of us making recommendations about these things, that is now not an apparent problem. And the fourth thing I want to just mention is this issue of containment. In New Zealand post-COVID-19, we are still keeping a lot of prisoners in their cells for far too long, sometimes 23 hours a day, and only giving them 1 hour of sunshine. Now, what happens then is that the provisional report goes to the prison. They can comment on whether there are any factual inaccuracies. Then the report comes back to me after my team have assessed the feedback. I then decide how important the issue is. I usually table my report in the Parliament of New Zealand. I then have a press release and I release the report publicly. A question I'd like you to ask is, so what? Do we effect change? As a result of recommendations I make for improvement, do we achieve things? Yes, we do. For instance, tie-down beds, which we complained about in our visits, are now banned, illegal. The ligature points in prison cells I referred to have largely gone. The thing I want to keep on and on about from my visits is containment, which I think in New Zealand is unacceptably high. There is interest in this work. Invariably, once we have tabled a report, the press will ring my office. We then have a briefing about what I will say, and it's one of those areas of my work where I feel, as the Chief Ombudsman, I can speak publicly if I am of the view that prison conditions in a particular prison are such that I should speak. I think that that sums up the role that we have. I'm going to terminate the presentation from New Zealand at this point, and of course later, if there are further questions and answers that you would like, we'll be only too happy to help and to join in. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Peter Boshier, Chief Ombudsman of New Zealand, and Mr. Tom, for your brilliant presentation. And you shared your experience as NPM and highlights some activities of torture prevention. Also, Mr. Tom focused on the inspection of the NPM and the checklist. He also highlighted as the first speaker, dialogue, also dignity of detainees, also implementing change by following up recommendations made by NPM. Thank you so much for presentation. The next speaker is Mrs. Timberire Ngema, Director of Legal Services, Judicial Inspectorate for Correctional Services. We have 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you to Program Director, and I extend my warm greetings to the panelists, the distinguished guests, and ladies and gentlemen. I am Tembelihle, as has been introduced, and with me is Mr. D'Souza, who's the head of our inspections and investigations at JICS, and Ms. Rebecca, who is the researcher in the office of the IJ. Again, I would like to extend Justice Cameron's apologies. He was initially invited to speak in this webinar, but he was not available for today. Today, I would like to speak about what we have highlighted as a concern during our inspections in the previous year. Firstly, our first democratic president of South Africa and the most famous prisoner, Dr. Rolihlahla Nelson Mandela, once said, "No one truly knows a nation until one has been inside its jails. A nation should not be judged by how it treats its highest citizens, but its lowest one." One may pause and ask him or herself as to how we may ameliorate the conditions and treatment of people in places of detention. But before I get to what we have highlighted as a significant concern, I would like to give a short background on JICS. JICS is established in terms of Section 85 of the Correctional Services Act, and its main role is to facilitate the inspections and of correctional services in order that the inspecting judge may report on the treatment of inmates in correctional centers and also on conditions in correctional centers. The inspecting judge inspects and reports on conditions as well as on corrupt or dishonest practices in correctional centers. We also investigate allegations of torture and gross violation of human rights in places of detention. Our inspections will include announced and unannounced visits. Section 7, subsection 2 of the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa obliges the state to promote and protect the rights in the Bill of Rights. The establishment of JICS was one of the steps taken by the state to give effect to the section in respect of the people in places of confinement. Recently, the Constitutional Court underscored two features of JICS. First, it highlighted JICS' critical role in upholding human rights when it observed that correctional centers remain fatal breeding grounds for autocracy and human rights abuses. It is within this context that the Judicial Inspectorate carries out its mandate with the constitutional rights of incarcerated person hanging in the balance. Second, it affirmed the necessity of JICS independence when it noted that to effectively scrutinize correctional centers and remand detainees facilities, an oversight body should maintain an arm's length relationship with the department. It should be sufficiently insulated from undue influence or capture by the very department officials whose conduct is charged with monitoring. In addition, it must gain the confidence and trust from inmates. Inmates confide in the work done by a correctional center oversight board will depend largely on the extent to which that body is perceived as being independent. Since the ratification of OPET by the Republic of South Africa and the subsequent establishment of NPM, JICS is part of the local preventive mechanism, which is coordinated by the South African Human Rights. JICS accordingly reports in line with the OPET. As JICS, we have some institutional concerns. Whilst we have a wide-ranging mandate, there are other overarching weaknesses that we have. Firstly, is that despite being a watchdog body, we lack operational, managerial, and executive powers over the Department of Correctional Services. As a result, the department has no obligation to implement the recommendations and findings of JICS. Sometimes the department will not comply even with the legislative obligations that they already owe to JICS. For example, mandatory reporting. The Act requires the department to report on all issues of deaths, use of force, segregations, and mechanical restraints. But it's so saddening that sometimes the department is found wanting to meet these obligations. And there has been an escalation in the incidence of the use of force within the correctional services. JICS was so very much concerned in the sense that we are organizing a seminar on the use of force because the numbers have went up compared to other years. So coming to what we flagged as a significant concern in correctional centers is overcrowding. The overcrowding of correctional centers for both remand detainees and sentenced offenders is a central issue that has a negative spillover effect. As of 26 March 2021, there were 140,750 inmates in South African correctional services for approved accommodation of 120,567. Our centers are thus overcrowded by 17%. Of these, there are 47,808 remand detainees, 132 state patients, and 92,815 sentenced offenders. It is noteworthy that remand detainees are a significant chunk of the prison population. Overcrowding has a threefold impact. First, it negatively impacts prisons' conditions as they become dilapidated, unhygienic, and unsanitary places. Second, it undermines possible good governance and administration in correctional centers. Correctional officials cannot properly oversee and manage all inmates, which creates breeding grounds for violence and sexual violence to occur with impunity. Third, it undermines opportunities for rehabilitation in correctional centers to combat high recidivism rates. Despite the Act's emphasis on rehabilitation, it seems that rehabilitation is treated as a luxury and not a necessity. It is important to note that overcrowding in correctional centers is a systemic issue and is a product of various factors, which include mandatory minimum sentencing, the war on drugs, unaffordable bail amounts, dysfunctional parole processes, and lags in the court processes. These complex issues go to the heart of criminal justice reform, and these changes require political will from various stakeholders. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed crisis overcrowding in correctional centers. Correctional centers, especially those ones that are overcrowded, are a reservoir for the spread of infectious and communicable diseases. In the context of COVID-19, inmates locked up in congregate settings with bad ventilation are unable to sanitize and socially distance. For these reasons, many jurisdictions have witnessed the pandemic spread through their prison populations. Given the potential for COVID-19 spread rampantly in prisons, it has urged governments across the world to respond in extraordinary ways. Many jurisdictions have taken steps to reduce the prison population by releasing inmates. In South Africa, the Presidential Remission of 2019 and the early consideration of parole in May 2020 play a role in reducing overcrowding. As of 26 March 2021, 17 inmates were identified to benefit from the Special Dispensation Program, and thus far only 13,813 have benefited from the program. While there are welcome developments, some may have been offset by the South African government approach to deal with the pandemic through blunt criminal law, which resulted in various arrests for violation of the lockdown regulations. The COVID-19 pandemic ushers in some important reflections. If we were able to release or divert classes that are not considered a threat to society, should they have been behind bars in the first place? Is it fair and just for bail to be based on monetary amounts? That's what we can ask ourselves. At the beginning of the hard lockdown in South Africa, JICS was inundated with complaints in respect of bail money, some as little as 50 rands or 100 rands. How can we take the lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic and implement them in normal times? Should these measures be implemented to combat the spread of other communicable and infectious diseases like tuberculosis? Do we need to change our approaches to crime and punishment? In conclusion, ultimately, JICS is committed to its mandate of ensuring that inmates are detained and incarcerated in conditions consistent with human dignity. It is a complex task, but one that we are deeply committed to. JICS welcomes any engagements from other stakeholders and interested parties. I thank you.
Correctional services in South Africa, and also the obligation of the government to implement recommendations. Also, issue of overcrowding, which is very crucial in this time of COVID-19 pandemic. We are now ending up our presentation, but there are some questions. There's some question raised. There's some question raised by participants, and I'd like first of all to once again to thank panelists for the presentation. There's some question. One question is will be answered by Honorable Chief Ombudsman for New Zealand, Mr. Boshier. There's someone who asked, can you highlight how you monitor the implementation of recommendations to ensure change in the system? That's the first question for you. There is another question for Mr. Tom Lotz. What immediate action does your inspector team take when you observe act of torture and violation during any inspection? The floor is yours, Mr. Boshier, the Chief Ombudsman of New Zealand, for the first question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to answer this question. It's really important, I think, that when recommendations are made, you follow them up to see whether or not there is action taken, because otherwise our work just becomes procedural. So we do follow-up visits. We'll go into a prison or one of the other facilities, particularly mental health facilities, which I have to say we have been critical of for overcrowding. We will, in our report, recommend what steps we think they should take to reduce the problem. We then go back 6 months or later and re-inspect, and will re-recommend if we feel that the steps taken have not been sufficient. Now, you might ask, well, yes, but what change can you bring if they don't take notice? And my answer is, the public really want to know how these facilities are performing, and they take a real interest in our reports. Just recently, in the new area of managed quarantine and aged care, I just want to say that between the time that we did our provisional report and our final report, a lot of these facilities changed because they didn't realize that the practices that they were using were wrong and needed to change. So my experience has often been a willingness to change, and that's what I encourage you to try and bring about. Tom, over to you for the question that's been posed to you.
Thanks very much, Peter. Luckily, on our inspections, to the best of my knowledge, we have never been confronted with an issue of torture. However, if we were confronted with a serious issue, we would immediately raise it with the director or manager of the facility. We would then escalate it to the Chief Ombudsman if this couldn't be resolved immediately, or refer it to relevant investigative bodies such as the police or the Health and Disability Commission, who do have the power to undertake investigations into issues. I think this really highlights the importance of having really good relations with other actors working in the protection and human rights space. Thanks.
I think we've lost the facilitator on connection. Let me just try to let her in. But I can fill up on the next question that I see on the chat while we are waiting for her to come back in. For Mr. Ben, there's a question from Motau Trolowe, who is asking if Mr. Buckland can share his experience on the benefits multiple body NPMs and how to deal with power struggle within the space to ensure achievement of its objectives. Ben, please let's go on with that while you're waiting for the facilitator to come back in.
Thanks a lot. I'd actually noticed 3 questions directed at me in the chat, and you picked the hardest of the 3. I mean, I think maybe Chief Ombudsman Boshier would be better placed to answer that. But I mean, just a beginnings of an answer, I think, are just to do with what the one of the NPM bodies in the UK just called kind of sensible grown-up conversations. I think that you can establish working groups and you can establish these formal systems for cooperation among oversight institutions, and I think those formal systems are really, really important. But at the end of the day, you also just need personal relations between people in those institutions at different levels, and to have that kind of regular interaction is really key. It's one of the reasons why I think at the APT we always get stressed when there's a change of leadership in organizations, because particularly with ombuds institutions as distinct from human rights commissions, for example, there's one person at the top, and if that person decides that torture prevention isn't a priority for them, or decides that they don't want to cooperate with other oversight institutions, or decides that they're not interested in really fulfilling the mandate in the way that they should, then a lot of things can fall apart that shouldn't fall apart. So I'm not sure that's a particularly satisfactory answer, but maybe Chief Ombudsman Boshier can complete me a little bit on that. Very quickly, because I think there were 2 other interesting questions that had my name on them. Please go ahead, answer. Yes. One was about how APT can help ombuds institutions who are not NPMs. I think we're really interested in working with ombuds institutions that are not NPMs, and in particular, I think this kind of platform provided by IOI and AOMA and others is really essential for that. And we're really committed to continuing this kind of cooperation. We're also, because of COVID, developing a lot more online tools, an e-learning platform and so forth that's going to be open to everyone, not just NPMs. And then there was a last question about prolonged solitary confinement that I think was pointed at me. As we know in the Mandela rules, solitary confinement that goes on longer than 15 days can amount to torture and should be banned. And I know that Tom talked a lot about how your analysis of these kind of things is also linked to, are they being used with people who are already in situations of vulnerability, with children or people in with mental or physical disabilities? And I think this really has to be part of the analysis that prevention bodies do when they're looking at things like solitary confinement. When it is used, is it necessary? Is it proportional? And is it not being used longer than 15 days? Sorry, I think I spoke really quickly then.
Okay, thank you. There were other questions. I don't know if the facilitator is already back on. Honorable Madeleine, are you there? Tom, there was another question for you there. I don't know if you saw it, and I don't know if you've answered it. It's saying, what immediate actions does your inspection team take when they observe act of torture and violation during an inspection.
Thanks, Frankie. Yeah, I briefly talked about that before. Cheers.
Oh, okay. There's another question. I don't know if this was being asked for the Ombudsman of New Zealand. Does the Chief Ombudsman in New Zealand have jurisdiction over military detention centers? If so, how do inspection of those detention centers take place, especially in as far as inspections without warning are concerned?
Thank you, Frankie. I'm very happy to answer that question and to also deal with Ben's invitation, just to say how the NPMs in New Zealand work together. We do not have jurisdiction over the one military detention centre in New Zealand. There is a separate NPM within the military system that oversees the military prison. So that's the brief answer to that question. The question about how we get on is a really, really good one. And I'll tell you how it works. There are 3 or 4 of us who constitute the NPM. It's important when there are more than one that there is a chair, someone who brings everyone together. And in New Zealand, that's the Human Rights Commission. What we do is work out our designation as to who does what. So for instance, I do mental health facilities. The Children's Commissioner in New Zealand does youth residence facilities. The police are responsible in what's called the Independent Police Conduct Authority for looking at court cells and see. So look, I think it is important that if there are a number, one cooperates, have meetings, discuss what you are seeing, and have very, very clear who's going to do what. And just to sum up this, tomorrow afternoon in New Zealand, we have one of these meetings of the National Preventative Mechanism, and for 2 hours we will all report and agree on our ongoing work program. So I hope you find that useful.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. There's another question. There's another, I think, couple of questions from Gail Mark, and I think I will just, I think, comment. You will all comment on it. Gail Mark is saying administrative detention by Israel of Palestinian is administrative detention is incarceration without trial or charge, alleging that a person plans to commit a future offense. It has no time limit, and the evidence on which it is based is not disclosed. So the question are, just how can the world and the UN allow this to happen in Israel? Why isn't this administrative detention banned globally? I think you just comment on that if you can. All our 4 speakers, we'll appreciate if you can comment on that. We can start with Ben.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, if I can talk generally about administrative detention, we published a few years ago a guide on monitoring migration detention, which is another form of this. We had some really interesting conversations internally about the question of, well, if we publish a guide on it, are we in some ways legitimizing this kind of detention, which I think many of us would agree is pretty problematic. Detention of migrants and other forms of administrative detention. And I think the point we arrived at was that even if we think that it's deeply problematic, it's a reality in many parts of the world, and it's important that monitoring bodies access those places, look at what's happening in them, and make recommendations about how they can be improved. I think it's a pragmatic approach that deals with the fact that for now, administrative detention isn't going away. And that it's important that oversight bodies engage with it and try and improve things, even if maybe we'd wish that they didn't exist at all.
Well, I'm happy to comment, Frankie, but I think really that there are two aspects to this. One is we don't comment, of course, as the National Preventative Mechanism of New Zealand on what any other sovereign state does. Even with Australia, with whom we have a very close working relationship, we do not comment on how each other is undertaking the work. It's recognised that that's each country's business. But the second thing is, and I know that Uli Grosshofer is probably still listening, the IOI puts out some very, very good guides, and I would really suggest and encourage use of the IOI website, which has rich material on how to undertake this role and when to act and how to act and who to talk to. That's, I think, a really good avenue that you might like to look at. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Tom, nothing to say?
No, thanks for your answer, Peter. Cheers.
Okay. We have another intervention from the Office of the Ombudsman for the Nchr Egypt. There's Mr. Nabil Chalabi who wanted to contribute or to share the experience in Egypt, because actually Egypt was been also instrumental in visiting places of detention. So maybe for 3 to 5 minutes, because we are almost at the end, before we hand over to the president of AOMA to close, I will give 3 to 5 minutes to Mr. Nabil Chalabi to say something. I know there are other questions that were not answered, but what we'll do, we'll send them to our panelists, to our speakers, and once they answer them, we will post them on our website. But for now, let us hear from Mr. Nabil Chalabi. Are you there, Mr. Nabil? Mr. Nabil? Yes, we can hear you, Mr. Nabil.
Yes. صباح الخير.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. صباح الخير. صباح الخير.
صباح الخير. صباح الخير.
صباح الخير. أنا بشكركم وسعيد إن أنا موجود مع حضراتكم.
Please use the interpretation facility. For Arabic, select German, please. Yeah.
Yes.
Go ahead, Mr. Nabil.
Thank you. أنا بشكركم وبشكر كل المداخلات اللي تمت حتى الآن، وكمان بحب في البداية إن أنا أهني السيدة مادلين على توليها أمين المظالم أو رئيس الأمبودزمان في رواندا، وسعيد جدا بأن أنا موجود في أن أنا أتحدث معكم بخصوص.
Hold on, Mr. Chalabi, we don't have the interpretation. We don't have the Arabic interpretation.
Yes.
If Yasmin can please assist. Yasmin, are you there?
Yes, Frankie. Yes.
Okay. Okay. Please help us.
But please, okay, please just list me as interpreter, please. I'm not as interpreter.
No, it's okay. You just go ahead. Go ahead. We can hear you.
Okay.
Can we all hear Yasmin? Yeah, go ahead. Okay, Mr. Nabil, go ahead now.
Yeah. Thank you. بالنسبة لجزئية أماكن الاحتجاز وإمكانية زيارتها وإزاي المؤسسة الوطنية
according to the places of detention and how the Nchr
المجلس القومي لحقوق الإنسان بيقوم بيها. بحب أكد بس إن المجلس خلال العام الماضي ده بس قام
we just emphasize that the last year
قام بالعديد من الزيارات للسجون في مختلف المناطق.
The National Council for Human Rights visited different places of detention.
نفذنا زيارات تقريبا لعدد من نهاية أكتوبر 2019 حتى بداية فبراير 2020.
Since the last of October till February 2020.
إن تم التوقف عن الزيارات بسبب جائحة كورونا وتأثيرها وانعكاسها على الوضع العالمي.
And stop visiting because of the pandemic of corona.
Yes. كمان بدأ استئناف زيارات السجون مرة تانية خلال نهاية عام 2020.
And we start visiting again the detained places in 2020 after the circumstances come stable.
بعد كده قمنا بعدد من الزيارات المشتركة مع منظمات المجتمع المدني والإعلاميين ومراسلي وسائل الإعلام الداخلي والخارجي.
We visited the places of detention in cooperation with the other institutions and the media and another outside institutions.
ويتصادف اليوم ان احنا متجهين لزياره احدى السجون في محافظه الاسكندريه بمصر.
And today we will be visiting a place of detention in Alexandria in Egypt.
سجن برج العرب.
برج العرب prison.
دي زياره مشتركه بتضم عدد من منظمات المجتمع المدني وعدد من المراسلين والإعلاميين والمجلس القومي لحقوق الإنسان.
It's in cooperation with another NGOs and the media.
وده عادة أي زيارة بيقوم بها المجلس لمتابعة أوضاع السجون بتكون قائمة على فكرة الاطلاع على أوضاع السجن من الداخل. ويمكن الزميل في نيوزيلندا اتكلم على عدد من المحاور اللي بيتبعها في زيارته للسجون ومتابعة أحوال السجناء.
Our visit to determine the treatment and the conditions in the prison and the condition of the prisoners, and as the New Zealand Mr. Tom in New Zealand tell us about the measurements of visiting prisons.
من أهم هذه المحاور هي الاطلاع على وضعية السجن من حيث البنية التحتية وقدرته على استيعاب عدد السجناء الموجودين فيه.
The first measure to know the capacity of the prison and all the conditions inside it.
كمان لقاء عدد من السجناء والاطلاع والاستماع إلى مطالبهم.
And also visit some prisons and to hear to their complaints.
بس الأهم من ده كله في البداية إن إحنا بنلتقي بالقائم على السجن وبنطلع على أهداف الزيارة.
And before all this, the most important thing that we visit first those who are working in the prisons to know all about the prison we visited.
وكمان بنبدأ بعد كده نبدأ الزيارة للاطلاع بالتجول داخل مرافق السجن بالكامل. من المستشفيات أو مستشفى السجن أو العيادات والصيدليات الموجودة فيه.
At first, we start to visit all departments in the prison, starting with the hospital.
بعد كده بنبدأ نشوف عدد من الخدمات الأخرى زي مكان الطعام، إعداد الطعام، وبعد كده مكان تناول الطعام الخاص بهم المطعم.
And then we go to visit the whole activities and the restaurant and how they eat and the place that they take their meals.
وبعد كده الكافيتيريا الخاصة بالسجن اللي هي خاصة بالكانتين اللي بيوفر لهم المستلزمات اللي بيشتروها من داخل السجن.
And also the canteen in the prison and how they food there.
كمان الأهم من كده إن إحنا بيبقى عندنا بعض المطالب أو الالتماسات أو الشكاوى اللي بتجيلنا من عدد من السجون، ودي بتكون الأساس في الهدف من الزيارة، إن إحنا بنبقى رايحين نتأكد من صحة هذه الشكاوى من عدمه.
And our priority to solve complaints that we have received before we go to this visit, and this is the priority of our visit to any prison we go.
فمثلا زي الزياره بتاعت النهارده، احنا عندنا بعض الشكاوى اللي موجوده من بعض المساجين بتتكلم عن مطالبهم خاصه بالحق في الرعايه الصحيه.
As an example, for our visit today, we received complaints concerning their health care.
فعادة في الزيارة زي زيارة اليوم بيكون رئيس وفد المجلس اللي بيزور، بيكون أحد أعضاء المجلس، وبيكون طبعا لما يكون في حاجات متعلقة بالجوانب الصحية بيكون طبعا بيفضل إذا كان طبيب. فاحنا عندنا من أحد أعضاء المجلس هو الدكتور صلاح سلام، هو بيكون موجود معانا للتأكد من أن الخدمة الصحية بتقدم لهم بجانب كبير جدا.
And we had the head of the committee for this visit, and he is a member in the National Council for Human Rights, Dr. Salah Salem, to be sure of the health care in the prison.
ففي الحالة دي بنطلب من إدارة السجن إن هي تطلعنا على الملفات الطبية الخاصة بالسجناء اللي ليهم شكاوى عندنا أو مظالم عندنا، وبنبدا بيتاكد هو سيادته بحكم المهنه من صحه الحاله ومتابعه الرعايه اللي بتقدم ليها ونوعيتها وجودتها.
And we see all the medical files of the prisons and the medical files of those who send complaints, and the member of the National Council for Human Rights see all this file and how it works, and to be sure of all healthcare measurements.
كمان بعد كده بنبدا ننتقل لبقيه الجوله الخاصه بالزياره، وده عاده بتكون متعلقه ب زي مثلا مكان التعليم، اذا كان في وحده خاصه بتقديم ده فصل دراسي لتعليم بعض السجناء غير المتعلمين، ونشوف جوده التعليم المقدمه لهم شكلها ايه.
And then we go to the places of education. If there is some prisons still educated.
بنلتقي كمان برجال الدين اللي هم بيقوموا بتعليم السجناء كل حسب اعتقادي الديني
and also
في تلقي الدروس الدينية الخاصة بعقيدتهم.
And also we visited the religion persons who teach people there according to their religion.
كمان بيبقى من ضمن جولة الزيارة إذا كان السجن نفسه فيه نوعية من الحرف أو ورش التصنيع، بننتقل لزيارتها والتأكد من يعني بنشوف قد إيه جودة المهن اللي بيمتهنها السجناء، إزاي هم بيتعلموا حرف جديدة.
And also visited the places where prisons treat for some jobs.
كمان في نهاية الجولة نلتقي بالقائم على السجون واللي هو مأمور السجن أو مدير منطقة السجون الموجود، ونطلعوا بنتائج الزيارة ورؤيتنا والتوصيات اللي احنا عايزين نقدمها لهم.
And finally, we meet some persons, and we meet the head of the prison to tell him about our visit and give him a report.
حابب بس أقول حاجة في النهاية بخصوص أماكن الاحتجاز برضو، إن المجلس كان له دور كبير جدا خلال السنوات الأخيرة في مراجعة العديد من التشريعات الخاصة بالمؤسسات العقابية.
And finally, I want to emphasize something, that the National Council for Human Rights in Egypt has a big role in changing or amending some laws concerning prisons and concerning places of detention.
يعني كان عندنا قانون تنظيم قواعد الدنيا لمعامله السجناء وقانون تنظيم السجون. كان احد اعضاء المجلس رحمه الله عليه الدكتور حافظ ابو ساده كان في اللجنه اللي كانت بتراجع هذا القانون، وكان في اضافات جيده فيها لتحسين اوضاع السجون والسجناء، وبالفعل اتحققت كل المطالب اللي اوصى بها المجلس.
And there is something concerning there is amending concerning laws concerning the prisons and improving prison conditions, and all this has been approved from the government.
كمان في حاجه مهمه جدا برضو حابين نتكلم بخصوصها، خاصه ان هي متعلقه بجائحه كورونا. ان طوال تلك الفتره منذ اندلاع الجائحه حتى الان المجلس من جانبه بيتابع حالة السجون من الداخل.
And also there is a very important thing during all the pandemic of Corona. The National Council for Human Rights determine all the prisons care health inside the prisons.
One more minute, Mr. Nabil.
Yes. كمان في ظل هذه الجائحه وفي الحالات اللي كانت موجوده من الداخل اتاكدنا ان السجون كانت خاليه تماما، لان كان في اجراءات عديده جدا قامت بها السجون لصالح حمايه السجناء، وده كان سبب توقف الزيارات لاسر السجناء والمنظمات والمجالس الوطنيه ان هي تقوم بزياره السجن من الداخل.
And we are sure that there is no any corona cases inside the prisons because we stop all the visits during the corona pandemic.
ولكن مع بداية هذا العام بدأت الزيارات ترجع لمسارها تاني من بداية يناير، من بداية ديسمبر ويناير إلى الآن. بس الزيارات مشتركة مع منظمات المجتمع المدني والإعلاميين وإلى آخره.
In January, we started the visits again in cooperation with the NGOs and the media.
كمان في فكرة العلاج مشكلة التكدس داخل السجون عندنا حالات العفو والإفراج الشرطي وإفراج نصف المدة والعفو الرئاسي، وكمان توجيهات النيابة العامة بتفتيش على السجون ومتابعتها وتبسيط إجراءات الحبس الاحتياطي شكلت جانب كبير جدا في خروج عدد كبير جدا من المساجين او السجناء من السجون، مما قلل فرص التكدس داخل هذه السجون.
And this year there is a big number of releases that decreased the capacity in the prisons.
Thank you so much, Mr. Nabil. Thank you for that contribution. And I see we've gone over our time. We've gone over by almost 12 minutes. But before we end this, I would like to ask from our panelists, do you have any last comment, anything else to add, or any comment about what Mr. Nabil has just shared with us? Ben?
No, I don't want to take any more of everyone's time, but just to say thank you enormously to the organizers, to the other panelists and the participants from all over the world. It's a real privilege to be able to cooperate with you, and I really hope that we can stay in touch. Please feel free to email me, and let's continue this important conversation. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Boshier.
Exactly the same with me. I don't feel the need to comment, but rather to thank you very much, Mr. Nabil, for that presentation. Look, it's been a privilege to participate. Every country will do this role in a way that you're comfortable with. It's taken us a long time to get to this point. Sometimes it's a matter of small beginnings, but it's worthwhile and is so much reflective of the important work that the NPM does and Ombudsman can do. So I hope you found it useful. I hope you found it interesting. Let's do this again sometime. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Tom, anything?
Privilege to present this evening. It's an absolute privilege to be carrying out this work, and I really hope this evening was useful for everybody, and thank you very much. And
okay. Ms. Tembeshile?
Thank you. I would like to thank the organizers and the panelists. This was a very informative session. I hope we'll be having next ones where we can also learn more from other stakeholders. And lastly, to the organizers, is it possible for us to get the presentations from other panelists? Because sometimes the network was very bad. There were glitches here and there. So if we can have them, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. All the presentation will be received and will be shared on our website. Even the video for those who want to rewatch this webinar, it will be posted on our website. We will inform you. It will be within a week from now. We'll have all the presentations and the video will be also on our website. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate. Ben, you are a star. Thank you very much. Mr. Boshier, Tom Lords, Mr. Bensilet, we really appreciate. We really appreciate. And to all the participants, if you have any comment, any feedback, please help us out to improve this, because actually we think from now on this will be the best medium of communication with what COVID-19 has brought to us. Please feel free to send us your questions. We'll send them to the panelists and they will be happy to respond to them. We will post the presentations, and please send us your feedback. What do you want us to improve? And any topic that you want us to deal with in future. So we're reaching the end, and thank you so much.